You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Elections Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's April 15th, 1927, at a restaurant inside the Peabody Hotel in Memphis. Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover has just arrived in Tennessee. He's been sent by President Coolidge, charged with leading the federal government's response to a horrific natural disaster. After months of heavy rain, the Mississippi River has swelled to unprecedented levels, and days ago, a levee broke at Mound's Landing in Mississippi. Experts say that within a matter of weeks, the entire levee system will collapse. Hoover sits down for an important breakfast meeting with Rowlett Payne, the mayor of Memphis, but their meeting has been hijacked by an intrepid reporter who fires off questions, much to Hoover's chagrin. Secretary Hoover, what do you plan to do about the situation in the flood zones? Hoover doesn't have time for these questions. There's work to be done and lives to be saved. So Hoover ignores the reporter. He shoves a bite of food in his mouth and fiddles with the dial of his watch. He's been in government long enough to know that in a crisis, timing is everything. Let me see your watch, Mr. Mayor. It's important that we're in lockstep. As Hoover and the mayor sync their watches, the reporter asks again, "Do you have a plan to deal with the refugee problem in the flood zones, Mr. Hoover?" Annoyed, Hoover sets down his knife and fork, dabs his mouth with a napkin, and gets down to brass tacks. Look, there are 3 things to be done with the flood victims. First, we must get them out. Second, we must feed them. And third, and most important of all, we must start their lives over when the waters recede. And how do you plan to do that? Money. I reckon it'll take a lot of money, Mr. Secretary. The United States is certainly rich enough, don't you think? As the reporter jots down Hoover's comment, Hoover turns back to the mayor. All right, Mayor Payne, what's the situation on the ground here? Well, it's pitiful. We're doing what we can to save what we can. Personal belongings, livestock, pets. But the situation is dire. Well, there isn't much humor in it, that's for certain. Hoover checks his watch again. He's behind schedule. So he calls out to the waiter. Check, please. Oh, I've already taken care of that, Mr. Hoover. Oh, you didn't have to do that, Mr. Mayor. I may be in government, but I still make enough to pay for my own food. But thank you. As the mayor smiles and reporter scribbles away, Hoover quickly stands and gathers his things. Thank you again, but wish me luck, gentlemen. I've got to hustle off. Get on the job. During the Great Flood of 1927, the man-made levees in the lower Mississippi Valley proved no match for the power of Mother Nature. Heavy rains had begun in August of 1926, and they lasted for an entire year. As a result, the many branches of the vast Mississippi River began to overflow, and one by one, the levees began to burst. Before it was all over, 16 million acres in the South would be covered in water. Entire farms, towns, and whole communities would be submerged, and hundreds of thousands of Americans would be displaced. In the midst of this unprecedented crisis, Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover would try to live up to his nickname, the Master of Emergencies. Wicked Game is sponsored by NetSuite. There's that saying, that's just the cost of doing business, and it makes it sound like there's nothing you can do about certain expenses. And yeah, sure, if you run a business, there are certain things that are just going to cost what they cost. And recently, they've probably begun costing more. But not everything is just the cost of doing business. Smart companies know their numbers and can reduce their costs. One great way of doing both is switching to NetSuite, the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one platform and one source of truth. And with NetSuite, you'll reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required, accessible from anywhere. You'll cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because you've got one unified business management suite, and you improve efficiency by bringing all your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move, so do the math and see how you'll profit with NetSuite this year. By popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/elections. That's netsuite.com/elections, netsuite.com/elections. Wicked Game is sponsored by BetterHelp. I need to get something off my chest. Think about that phrase. Visualize it. The metaphor is that something is literally on your chest, weighing you down, pressing down upon you, that when you lay in bed at night, there's a heavy burden bearing down on you. And everyone has these weights, deep concerns, feelings of guilt, anger, or misery we try to keep to ourselves. But therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever's weighing you down. And as the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist. And if things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. No waiting rooms, no traffic. It couldn't be simpler. So get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/elections today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/elections. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. Herbert Hoover was no stranger to crisis or tragedy. An Iowa native and the first American president born west of the Mississippi River, Hoover narrowly survived a respiratory infection at the age of 2. And by the age of 10, he had lost both his mother and father. Raised by his Quaker uncle, Hoover did not finish high school, but he learned valuable skills working at his uncle's real estate business. He had attended Stanford University in its inaugural class and graduated in the wake of the financial panic of 1893. Hoover struggled to find work, but ultimately rose above adversity and made millions as an engineer. He never forgot his humble beginnings, though. Throughout his life, he devoted his time and resources to various humanitarian causes. He was in China for his honeymoon during the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, a violent anti-imperialist uprising. While confined there with his newlywed wife, Hoover coordinated relief efforts for trapped foreigners. At the outset of World War I, he helped countless Americans stranded in Europe escape the clutches of German forces. During the war, he spearheaded efforts to feed millions of Belgians who were under siege. His success as the head of the Commission for Relief in Belgium prompted President Wilson to appoint him head of the Food Administration, which put Hoover in charge of the American military's food supply overseas. President Harding appointed Hoover Commerce Secretary in March of 1921. A position he held for over 7 years across 2 administrations. As Commerce Secretary, Hoover had a finger in every pie. He was extremely effective, arguably the engine behind America's roaring economy and the driving force behind the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Hoover Dam. But the Great Flood of 1927 was perhaps Hoover's biggest challenge of all. From his headquarters in Memphis, Hoover coordinated the government's relief efforts. He commanded hundreds of volunteers and officials from the Army, the Coast Guard, the American Red Cross, and various local and state authorities. He helped manage the evacuation of over 750,000 Americans, and in the process, he helped save countless lives. But Hoover's relief efforts in the Mississippi Valley had another side. In camps all across the South, Black refugees suffered monstrous indignities and horrific abuses. As Black activists sought to expose the injustice, Hoover moved to suppress the truth. The Great Flood of 1927 helped position Hoover for a presidential run in the 1928 contest, an election that exposed dark realities about race relations in 1920s America. This is episode 36, 1928, Smith versus Hoover, Master of Emergencies. Not long after arriving in Memphis in April of 1927, Hoover stood on high ground and looked out over the gushing waters of the Mississippi River. He told a reporter, "At this moment, the volume of water passing Memphis is 10 times greater than that pouring over the Niagara Cliffs when the Niagara River is at maximum flood state." Hoover knew he had his hands full in Memphis. He called the flood the greatest peacetime disaster in our history, saying, "We are humble before such an outburst of the forces of nature and the futility of man in their control." But Hoover's efforts in the South would not prove futile. His first priority was rescuing stranded Americans. He quickly put together an assembly of Coast Guard vessels and private boats, yachts, and steamers. He ordered the evacuation of towns, farms, and villages downstream. He then personally designed and organized a refugee camp for displaced Americans set up on high ground. It was the first of its kind during the Great Flood, and Hoover's designs were replicated all across the South. With the assistance of the Red Cross, refugees were given food, water, clothing, shelter, and electricity, as well as schools, churches, and public gathering places. But these refugee camps, like the South itself, were segregated, and the disparity between the treatment of white and black was glaring. According to an article published by Yale's Historical Review, Black Americans in these refugee camps were forced to perform the heavy labor that supported the camps and were barred from escaping by National Guard members who oversaw their work with guns at the ready. White refugees were largely housed in indoor facilities. Black refugees were forced to live outside. They were denied the essentials they needed to survive and treated as second-class citizens. These injustices caught the attention of civil rights leaders like NAACP Chief Walter White, the writer Ida B. Wells, and a journalist named J. Winston Harrington. Harrington, a writer for the Chicago Defender, made a heroic effort to expose the conditions in the South, but he had to overcome a deft PR campaign orchestrated by Herbert Hoover. Mainstream newspapers like the New York Times largely ignored the abuses highlighted by the Chicago Defender. Miles McCurchie, the author of the Historical Review article, wrote, "At the center of his relief program was a mass media campaign highlighting Hoover's devotion to the Americans who had been displaced by the flood. The Red Cross, too, depended upon a positive portrayal of its relief efforts, which relied on public donations. Hoover's media campaign preserved his humanitarian legacy by hiding Red Cross racism from the nation at large." Publicly, Hoover professed sympathy for the condition of Black Americans in the South, telling the press, "We of the North have the duty to bind their wounds because they are of our own country." And Hoover flexed his humanitarian muscles and sought to personally raise millions of dollars for the relief effort in order to rebuild the decimated communities in the South. But in the face of claims of racism, discrimination, and abuse, Hoover did not sit on his hands. He appointed Robert R. Morton of the Tuskegee Institute to assemble an all-black panel to look into the claims. The committee determined that certain abuses had occurred, but they were not widespread. According to the committee's findings, the problem was not Herbert Hoover or the Red Cross. The problem was the local white farmers who wanted to make sure their interests were protected from the federal government's presence in the South. But the committee did find many abuses, both in the government agencies and inside the Red Cross. While white Americans received preferential treatment, Black Americans endured looting, unjust imprisonment, and inequitable distribution of resources. Though many civil rights leaders laid the blame at Hoover's feet, many Black Americans on the ground praised Hoover's efforts, and so did the mainstream press. The Great Flood was the biggest news story of 1927, even bigger than Charles Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic Ocean. In May, the New York Times wrote that Hoover was the man who will live longest in the grateful memory of the people, a man worthy of any honor that can be bestowed upon him. A newspaper in Idaho had an idea what that honor might be, writing, "America is sold on the organizing and directing genius of Hoover. No wonder this man is persistently advanced as the logical man for the swivel chair behind the big desk in the White House." Another paper in California wrote, "In personal fitness for the presidency, there is no other American, even remotely, in Mr. Hoover's class." But while Mr. Hoover was basking in the praise of the press for a job well done, President Coolidge was quietly enduring an onslaught of criticism. After the levees broke, Coolidge had failed to call a special session of Congress to deal with the disaster. Whereas Hoover was on the ground, often having his picture taken by the press, Coolidge remained in Washington, seemingly aloof. And as was his custom, Coolidge said very little to the press. In the face of a barrage of criticism, Coolidge finally departed Washington, but not to the disaster zone. He went on a working vacation in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Because the Great Flood was not the only issue plaguing Coolidge's administration in 1927. By the summer of that year, the racing economy of the Roaring Twenties had started to slow down. In a 1927 article in the New York Evening Post, in his capacity as Secretary of Commerce, Hoover wrote that peacetime slumps in business were the direct result of booms, so that the boom and not the slump should be the object of attack. But Hoover's calm assessment of the economic situation belied his private concerns. He had been deeply worried about the economy since as far back as 1922. He had warned President Harding then that he believed the post-war economy was a bubble bound to burst. And in 1926, Hoover had warned Coolidge that a growing tendency towards irresponsible speculation was a recipe for disaster. A year later, in 1927, Hoover tried to stave off the impending disaster by asking the Federal Reserve to intervene. His private efforts, though, would ultimately be too little, too late. As the economy began to show signs of weakness, his boss, President Calvin Coolidge, was nowhere to be found. It's late July 1927 in Rapid City, South Dakota, at a local high school. The school is being used as President Calvin Coolidge's summer White House. Coolidge came to the Black Hills in mid-June for a summer vacation, and he brought with him members of his staff and a small army of reporters, cameramen, and press agents. For the reporters, it's been a quiet couple of months, but that's about to change. As Coolidge sits at his temporary summer desk at his temporary summer White House, there's a knock at the door. "Excuse me, Mr. President?" "Come in, James. Have a seat." That's James Everett Sanders, the president's secretary. He sits down. "Well, I'm here because you wanted to see me, sir?" Yes. "What can I do for you, Mr. President?" Well, I don't believe I'll be seeking another term." Sanders is dumbfounded. Coolidge is extremely popular, unbeatable even, but Coolidge doesn't give Sanders a chance to express his opinion. "I know what you're going to say, Mr. Sanders, but the fact is, if I should serve as president again, I should serve almost 10 years, which is far too long for a president in this country." "Well, sir, I think the people will be disappointed." "Perhaps." Coolidge slides Sanders a piece of paper. "Read." Sanders blinks in confusion as he reads the president's words. "I'd like you to make an appropriate amount of copies for the press." Sanders does not know what to say. He looks up at Coolidge, his mouth slightly agape. "All right, Mr. Sanders, you're thinking something. That's clear. If you have an opinion, I'd like to hear it." But Sanders can tell the president's mind is made up. "Well, Mr. President, with respect, I believe you have no intention of heeding my advice, unless I agree with you." "Well, you're right. I'd like to make the announcement as soon as possible. How does Tuesday work?" "Tuesday should be fine." "All right then, 9 a.m. sharp, Mr. Sanders. We'll do it here in my office." "Yes, sir. As you wish, Mr. President." After his meeting with President Coolidge, James Everett Sanders ordered a stenographer to make copies of the president's words, 5 to 6 per sheet. Coolidge used a pair of scissors to meticulously cut the copies into individual slips. And at 9 a.m. sharp on Tuesday, August 2nd, 1927, President Calvin Coolidge ordered his small army of reporters to form a line outside his makeshift summer office. One by one, Coolidge handed each reporter his slip of paper. In a gesture befitting his nickname, Silent Cal Coolidge made his announcement without saying a word. The slips of paper read, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. Coolidge did, though, say at least one word at his silent press conference. When reporters asked the president if he wanted to comment on his statement, Silent Cal's reply was a brief no. What resulted was a flurry of speculation in the press. At the time Coolidge made his cryptic statement, Herbert Hoover was in the California redwoods, recovering from months of tireless work in the lower Mississippi Valley. Hoover wrote, "Within an hour, 100 men, publishers, editors, public officials, and others came to my camp demanding that I announce my candidacy." Coolidge's silent press conference instantly made Herbert Hoover the de facto frontrunner for the Republican Party. And though he never said so publicly, Hoover definitely wanted the job. The only question was, what did Coolidge really want? As Hoover explained, like most other people, I was puzzled by Mr. Coolidge's statement. The word choose has various connotations in its New England usage. The presidential tradition of declining the presidency dates back to America's first president, George Washington. To many, it seemed possible that with his cryptic remarks, Coolidge was trying to emulate Washington. It was possible that though Coolidge chose not to run again, if called to duty, like Washington before him, Coolidge might be compelled to accept the nomination. Herbert Hoover was not the type to speculate, though. He wrote, "I determined at once to say nothing until I could have a talk with the president." So in the early fall of 1927, Hoover did. The Master of Emergencies returned to Washington determined to get Silent Cal to start talking. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Election's Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it can doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Election's Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's September 1927 at the White House. Washington has been abuzz ever since President Coolidge's silent press conference in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Many believe Coolidge's message was clear. He will not run in 1928. Many others believe there's a chance he will indeed stand if his party nominates him. And the rumor mill has only been intensified by Coolidge's patent refusal to clarify his intentions publicly. Hoover is tired of the guessing game, so he pays Coolidge a visit to ask him face to face. Mr. President, thank you for seeing me. Come in, Mr. Hoover. What can I do for you? Well, sir, I must admit, when I read your brief statement, I was puzzled. Puzzled? I do not mean any disrespect, only... Hoover hesitates for a moment. He chooses his words carefully. Only, I have received a deluge of urgings from friends and others to give some indication of my attitude regarding the upcoming election. Hoover waits for the president to respond. But Silent Cal remains Silent Cal. So Hoover presses on. Mr. President, I told my friends I felt the country had great confidence in you and your administration. Well, I thank you for that. I also told my friends that I had much rather continue as a cabinet officer under you. Only I would greatly appreciate if you could tell me whether your statement was absolutely conclusive. Coolidge stares blankly at Hoover for a long moment. You've done a fine job as Commerce Secretary. I'm certain you'll do fine in whatever course you may pursue. Will that be all? In September of 1927, Herbert Hoover pressed President Coolidge to clarify his intentions regarding the 1928 election. In Hoover's own words, Coolidge made no direct reply. After the meeting, Hoover repeated a familiar refrain telling the press, Mr. Coolidge should be renominated. But deep down, he desperately wanted the nomination for himself. And he didn't let the matter rest. Months later, in February of 1928, Hoover pressed the issue again, this time over the question of the Ohio State primary, which was right around the corner. Hoover asked the president directly, will you allow your name to be filed? Coolidge replied, no. Hoover then asked the president how he felt about friends putting Hoover's name forward. Coolidge's response was quintessentially Coolidge. Why not? According to Hoover, the biggest obstacle to the 1928 Republican nomination was not Calvin Coolidge. It was the United States Senate. As Hoover wrote in his memoirs, for the first time in many years, they had elected one of their members directly from the Senate to the presidency in the person of Mr. Harding, and they liked the idea. The Republican senators couldn't agree on a single candidate to challenge Hoover, but they largely agreed that Hoover had to be stopped. in part because Hoover had taken a middle-of-the-road position on one of the most divisive political issues of the 1920s, the prohibition of alcohol. On the subject of prohibition, there were two basic camps, wet and dry. Wet politicians opposed the 18th Amendment. Dry politicians supported it. Hoover was neither strictly wet nor dry. He played both sides. He had said he opposed the repeal of the 18th Amendment for the time being, but he had also refused to say whether he would include protecting the 18th Amendment in his party platform. His have-it-both-ways approach angered senators on both sides of the issue. In the lead-up to the Republican convention, set to take place in June of 1928, Hoover's enemies in the Senate were merciless. They unaffectionately called him Sir Herbert, a shot at the fact that Hoover had periodically lived in England. But they did more than resort to name-calling. Under the pretext of rooting out corruption, these senators created a committee to investigate pre-convention expenditures. According to Hoover, the committee devoted most of the investigation to my friends. Though the fishing expedition into Hoover's campaign came up short, the senators did find something. In Hoover's memoirs, he wrote that the senators claimed, "I'd robbed a Chinaman some 26 years before and had been convicted in a British court. This became so annoying to my friends that they secured a written statement from almost every party to this old lawsuit, and every living lawyer on both sides connected with it. All these statements indignantly denied that there was the remotest truth in the libels." But in spite of resistance in the Senate, by May of 1928, things were largely looking good for Hoover. He had the support of most of the House of Representatives. He had received endorsements from many party stalwarts like former New York Senator Elihu Root and Supreme Court Justice and former President William Howard Taft. Hoover had also secured the commitment of as many as 400 delegates, and with the Republican convention just a few weeks away, the only remaining question was still, what was President Coolidge going to do? The Republican senators had struggled to find a candidate to challenge Hoover, in part because they were hoping against hope that Coolidge might decide to run at the last minute. Hoover himself wondered the same thing. After their meeting in September of 1927, Coolidge had never publicly clarified his position. Privately at times, he had even seemed to encourage the rumor mill, speculating that he would run. So in May of 1928, Hoover met with Coolidge again, determined to put the matter to rest. Hoover pledged fealty, telling the president that if he wanted the nomination, Hoover would gladly step aside and instruct his 400 delegates to support him. Coolidge replied, "I think if you have 400 delegates, you ought to keep them." For Hoover, it was as clear a statement of Coolidge's intentions as he was going to get. The nomination was Hoover's for the taking. The Republican convention in Kansas City began on June 12, 1928. Hoover did not attend. Instead, he sent one of his friends to put forward his name. His friend had barely begun his speech when the hall burst into a spontaneous eruption of cheers that lasted nearly half an hour. Hoover won on the first ballot with 837 votes. For his running mate, Republicans picked Senate Majority Leader Charles Curtis. Curtis would help Hoover on two fronts. As a Kansas man, he appealed to farmers, many of whom saw Hoover as out of touch with their needs. But perhaps more importantly, Curtis helped get the Republican Senate on the Hoover bandwagon. In a show of party unity, President Coolidge sent Hoover a congratulatory message that was printed in newspapers all across the country. "Your great ability and your wide experience will enable you to serve our party with marked distinction. I wish you all the success your heart could desire." The Republicans had their candidate and were united around the Hoover-Curtis ticket. But for the Democrats, the rise of a popular politician from a key electoral state, New York Governor Al Smith, would not bring unity to the party. It would sow the seeds of division. Republican Secretary Herbert Hoover and Democratic Governor Al Smith were not far apart ideologically. Both men were conservatives, and both were relatively mainstream in their opinions. But there were two issues that made Al Smith politically vulnerable. Smith was a child of Irish immigrants, and he was a Catholic. For many Southerners, especially members of the Ku Klux Klan and those sympathetic to their worldview, Smith would never get their endorsement. Secondly, Smith was decidedly wet on prohibition, which further put him at odds with white Southern voters. In 1924, Governor Smith had made a previous run at the Democratic nomination, but the KKK and the forces of opposition in the South had succeeded in blocking his path. In 1928, the Klan would try again. On June 26, the Democratic National Convention began in Houston, Texas. It was the first time a national convention was held in the Lone Star State, and it was the first Southern convention since the Civil War. Houston, though, was woefully ill-prepared for the event. The city didn't even have a proper convention hall. So in a matter of 64 days, Houstonians had erected the hastily built Sam Houston Hall, a 2,000-seat venue. Within the hall's doors, segregation was on full display. Whites and blacks were confined to separate seating areas, and just like in the 1924 convention, xenophobia took center stage. Dry Democrats and anti-immigrant delegates ferociously fought against Smith's nomination. But unlike the previous convention, this time Smith had the votes. This was in no small part because Smith had the unflinching support of a popular Northern Democrat, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At the convention, Roosevelt personally nominated Smith, saying, "We offer one who has the will to win, who not only deserves success, but commands it. Victory is his habit. The happy warrior, Alfred E. Smith." Democrats selected Senate Minority Leader Joseph T. Robinson of Arkansas as Smith's running mate. Robinson gave geographical balance to the ticket, and his staunch support of prohibition helped to quiet the concerns of many dry Southerners. Smith was a strong candidate, though, in his own right. Like Herbert Hoover, he was a self-made man, and while Hoover came from a rural background, Smith had pulled himself up by his own bootstraps in the urban epicenter of New York City. He had started his career as a fish seller. He had then risen through the ranks of Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine in New York, with lightning speed. And though his connections to the political establishment in New York made him vulnerable to the claims of corruption, Smith's personality gave him broad appeal. He was a charismatic candidate, good on the stump and on the microphone, an increasingly important characteristic.
I was born down at 174 South Street, in a little house right under the Brooklyn Bridge. You know, the bridge was erected when I was a small boy. My father was at the opening ceremony, and when he came home, he said, "Alfred, I've just witnessed a great spectacle, but at the same time, a very bitter disappointment."
Why, what did he mean?
Well, here's the story as he told it to me. He said, "Son, this bridge has kept thousands of men working for years. The steel cables, the concrete, the wiring, the machinery cost millions of dollars. Today was the opening. Bands were playing. Flags were waving. They cut the tape, and finally, it happened."
What happened?
Why, they found out that all you could do was go to Brooklyn.
Smith's folksy charisma was evident in his campaign song, "The Sidewalks of New York." But not everyone was seduced by Governor Smith's charm. In order for Democrats to take the White House in 1928, the party needed a solid South standing behind the Smith-Robinson ticket. But after the convention, Southern support would be hard to come by. Disgusted with Smith's nomination, the Ku Klux Klan and their supporters would abandon the Democratic Party. They would launch an effective propaganda campaign aimed squarely against Governor Smith. In the 1928 campaign, the Klan would sow the seeds of racism and xenophobia all across the country, and Republican candidate Herbert Hoover would reap the reward. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's election season, 1928 in Chicago, Illinois, and Republican nominee Herbert Hoover is exhausted. The work of a presidential candidate never seems to stop. Train rides, speeches, glad-handing, and worst of all, autographs. Hoover stands at the front of a never-ending reception line. He shakes hands with the young man and puts on a forced smile. I appreciate your support, son. I appreciate you, Mr. Secretary. Thanks to you, we've got a chicken in the pot and 2 cars in the garage. Just bought the missus a new one last month. I'm glad to hear it. Say, can I get an autograph? Of course. Thank you, Mr. Hoover. Thank you. Pleasure to meet you, son. As the young man goes on his way, Hoover turns to the next person in line, a surly lady with a smug expression on her face. And how do you do, ma'am? Don't you remember me? He doesn't, but he doesn't want to be rude. As she stares him down, Hoover tries to decide what to say. He settles on honesty. I'm sorry, madam, but I do not. The woman looks wounded. Well, I can't believe you don't remember me, of all people. Hoover is embarrassed, but he's still drawing a blank. Ma'am, as I said, I'm very sorry. I would like to, and no doubt could, if you would just remind me where we met. The woman's indignant. Why, I sat on the end of the 3rd row when you spoke in Indianapolis, and you looked right at me. Unsure of what to say, Hoover blurts out the first words that come to mind. Would you like an autograph? In his memoirs, Herbert Hoover wrote, anyone who believes that a presidential campaign includes a luxurious life for the candidate needs further instruction. Reading his words, it seemed Hoover did not enjoy the campaign trail or dealing with surly characters like the indignant woman from Chicago. Hoover wrote, another trial of campaign life is the autograph. I am convinced that I have 500,000 in circulation. Certainly, there is inflation in these issues. Like it or not, though, Hoover did campaign, and he did it well. He took his cues from his predecessor. When it came to speaking in public, Hoover, like Calvin Coolidge before him, understood that silence is golden. Calvin Coolidge had been the first presidential candidate in American history to use the radio as an active part of his campaign. Herbert Hoover was the first to use a silent film. The campaign biography titled Master of Emergencies focused on Hoover's humanitarian work during the Great War and his management of the Mississippi floods. The film's depiction of Hoover's efforts to help the flood victims was famous for bringing audiences to tears and to their feet. But Hoover made good use of the radio as well, broadcasting 7 radio addresses. But in these, he never mentioned Governor Smith by name. In his memoirs, Hoover wrote, Governor Alfred E. Smith was a natural-born gentleman. And during the campaign, according to Hoover, no word had been spoken by either of us which prevented sincere friendship the day after the election. Hoover and Smith may have comported themselves in a respectful manner, but the election of 1928 was anything but dignified. Historian and author Robert Slayton wrote, the election of 1928 was one of the most revolting spectacles in the nation's history. Both parties were flush with cash. The Democrats spent over $7 million, the Republicans nearly $9.5. Combined, that's the equivalent of nearly $250 million in today's money. Hoover's campaign slogan, a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage, would become an unforgettable and iconic saying that would persist through the generations. But not all of the Hoover campaign slogans were light and hopeful. Some were combative. Hoover and happiness, or Smith and soap houses. In another popular slogan in 1928, Republicans tried to paint a clear picture of the options on the ballot. It was Hoover, the Master of Emergencies, or Smith, the spectacle of idleness and ruin. But perhaps the ugliest part of the 1928 campaign was not the words exchanged between candidates, but the undue influence of the white supremacists of the Ku Klux Klan. In the 1928 election, the Klan and their allies used propaganda and hate speech to play on the xenophobic fears of American voters. They sought to paint Smith as an other, a low-down immigrant, a pawn of the Pope. Additionally, Smith's enemies attacked his connection to Tammany Hall and accused him of corruption. For many preachers across the country, a vote for Smith was a vote for the devil, a vote that would condemn one's soul to the fiery chasms of hell. In Florida, the school board sent notes home with children that read, "We must prevent the election of Alfred E. Smith to the presidency. If he is chosen president, you will not be allowed to read or have a Bible." And even in his home state of New York, a campaign leaflet contained a poem that read, "When Catholics rule the United States and the Jew grows a Christian nose on his face. When Pope Pius is head of the Ku Klux Klan and the land of Uncle Sam, then Al Smith will be our president, and the country not worth a damn." In addition, Governor Smith's anti-prohibition stance fueled suspicions that he was a degenerate and a drunk. These baseless rumors earned him the nickname Alcoholic Smith. In spite of the ad hominem attacks against him, Smith tried to rise above it, stating, "Let the people of this country decide this election upon the real issues of the campaign and nothing else." On one trip to Indiana, Smith's train passed a burning cross on the side of the tracks. Afterwards, Smith remarked, "I would sooner go down to ignominious defeat than to be elected to any office in this country. If to accomplish it, I had to have the support of any group with such perverted ideas of Americanism." Those perverted ideas might have benefited Herbert Hoover, because on Election Day 1928, Hoover dominated, winning 40 states and 444 electoral votes to Smith's 87. He became the first Republican candidate to win substantially in the South since the Reconstruction era. Hoover took Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. He also beat Smith in his home state of New York. On March 4th, 1929, Herbert Hoover was sworn in as America's 31st president.
You, Herbert Hoover, do solemnly swear that you will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and, to the best of your ability, that you will preserve, maintain, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
I do.
It might be said that Smith's loss was more significant than Hoover's victory. In the 1928 contest, Smith had positioned himself as the champion of the American worker and a true friend to immigrants. 4 years earlier, in 1924, America's 12 largest cities had voted Republican. In 1928, all 12 voted for the Democrat, Smith. Additionally, most of the farmers who had voted for the Progressive Party in 1924 also cast their ballots for Smith in 1928. And though Hoover's victory was an electoral landslide, the popular vote painted a different picture. Smith received over 15 million votes, twice what Democratic candidate John W. Davis had earned just 4 years earlier. And by the end of the 1920s, this coalition of Western farmers, urban workers, and immigrants were growing increasingly frustrated with the Republican Party and their conservative approach to government. On the campaign trail, Herbert Hoover had famously said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." In fact, more than any other issue, it was the economy that helped Hoover take the White House in 1928. The two previous Republican presidents had left behind a legacy of economic prosperity, and Hoover had reaped the benefits. But in the minds of many, that prosperity was for the few and not the many. And time would show that the Coolidge prosperity was, as Hoover had feared, a bubble bound to burst. Less than a year after Hoover's election, the stock market crash of 1929 would rock the nation. The U.S. economy would collapse, and federal policy would export the catastrophe all around the world. In the face of this unprecedented economic crisis, America's working class would demand a more equitable society and a government that worked for the little guy, and not just Wall Street. In the election of 1932, these Americans would find their champion in an iconic leader, a political giant, who is best known by the shorthand, FDR. This is episode 36 of American Election's Wicked Game, 1928, Master of Emergencies. On the next episode, the election of 1932. As President Hoover scrambles to rescue the country from the Great Depression, Democratic nominee Franklin Delano Roosevelt strives to take the country in a bold new direction. But to win his party's nomination, he'll have to face one of the most powerful Democrats in the country, former New York governor and previous presidential candidate Al Smith. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Election's Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Election's Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details. And while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Election's Wicked Game is an Airship production. Hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Sound designed by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and Ciel Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.